Let's do this. All right, guys. I got a good amount of shit to get through. Gonna start off a little bit stronger than usual. We're gonna do some longer clips than usual, and I just yeah. And while we're taking our time here, gonna blaze one up, and let's wait a minute to see while a few other people join. I am live on Twitch and YouTube, so we are good on both. Alright. Of course, going to touch on the Ukraine subject. I've got a fantastic first yoga experience tomorrow. Maybe even get to some tonight. I can feel like stretching. But let's start out right away. Let's start out strong. Just going to give everybody a few minutes to see that I'm live. I usually post around midnight, so might be a little bit later before people join. Alright. So yeah, Stoney Progressive. We are going to hit up the whole Ukraine subject several times, because that's the biggest story of the day, but I'm going to take it from a few different angles, of course. This one was posted yesterday. So we're going to start out with Lee Camp. I start with him a lot, and he was with Ben Norton recently. Yeah, let's give this a few minutes. Got a few joiners. All right, so the truth about Ukraine with Ben Norton. Ben Norton is an investigative journalist. This was posted today. I guess they usually film in the afternoon, so this might have been filmed last night or this afternoon. The filming really matters. Today was an interesting day.
I'm Lee Camp. What in the hell is going on in Ukraine? Should we answer that question? I think we should answer that question. To do that, I'll be speaking with one of the best journalists I know, Ben Norton, formerly with Gray Zone, now with Multipolarista. Ben has all the answers on what the mainstream corporate media refuses to tell you, which is a lot about what's going on in Ukraine. Hey, Ben, thanks for joining me again.
It's always a pleasure to be here, Lee. Thanks for having me.
You've really been doing great work with your new outlet, Multipolarista. I've really been enjoying it, so I thought it'd be good to get you back on to talk about what in God's name is going on in Ukraine. You've been researching it and writing about it, and Putin just this week declared the Donbass region independent states, and this is after weeks of lead up where the U.S. kept saying Russia is going to do a full invasion of Ukraine. And if you're like an average American news watcher, you just flip on CNN, NPR, Fox News, you would believe that all of this has been fine. Ukraine, just everyone happy, all good. And now Russia suddenly just declared part of Ukraine independent from greater Ukraine. But there's a much larger context to this whole story, going back to 2014 and even before. Can you walk us through what led up to this moment?
Absolutely, Lee. I'm glad you mentioned that date, 2014, because we can't understand what's going on now in Ukraine without understanding what happened in 2014. The reality is that a lot of the Western corporate media acts as though the conflict goes back to a few weeks or maybe the election of Donald Trump. But what happened in 2014 fundamentally changed the politics of Eastern Europe. There was a coup d'etat that was sponsored by the US government. And one of the main figures behind this coup in Ukraine in 2014 was named Victoria Nuland. She's a hardcore right-wing hawk, and she is the third in command right now of the State Department in the Biden administration. She was also a significant figure in the State Department in the Obama administration, and she and a team of anti-Russia hawks have been involved in
Oh, man. Everybody's been coming after Sleepy Joe in his speech today, so I got that for coming up later, too. Literally, like 6 channels did the White House press briefing today, so we should probably watch most of it. And then Sleepy Joe had some good stuff today, too. Yeah.
Pushing this policy in Ukraine, installing a government in Ukraine. We have recordings of Victoria Nuland personally naming who the leaders of the Ukrainian government would be back in 2014. And still today, she and these hardline right-wing anti-hawks in Washington have been pushing this aggressive policy, basically waging a proxy war on Russia through Ukraine. The Ukrainian government really is a kind of puppet government ever since this coup in 2014. And we should also stress another key element of this, which is the role of far-right extremists. I mentioned this 2014 coup. The muscle behind this coup in Ukraine.
That's not true. I mean, the vid happened in Italy pretty hardcore. That would probably be the biggest story the last couple years in Europe. This has the opportunity to be something, but I still don't. Yeah. Anyhow, let's go.
Were literal Nazis. Nazis and far-right extremists from groups like the Azov Battalion, the Right Sector. These
Is that your sexist comment of the day there for you?
are groups that claim that Ukrainians are white and Russians are non-white Asiatic peoples, and they believe that they have this white supremacist mission to purge their country of Ukraine of the supposedly impure Asiatic Russians. So these forces have played a significant role in this conflict. They were actually incorporated into the Ukrainian state. And then there's one other factor we need to understand, Lee. I mentioned the coup. I mentioned the role of right-wing extremists who have infiltrated the government in Ukraine. There's also the role of NATO. And this is a story that goes back to 1990 and 1991. We have so much evidence that shows that Western governments promised the Soviet Union, when they reunified Germany. Before Germany, during the First Cold War, it had a socialist government in the East and a capitalist government in the West. Well, when the Soviet Union agreed to allow German reunification, the Western powers, specifically the United States, Britain, and France, they all promised the Soviet Union and then Russia that NATO would not expand 1 inch east after the reunification of Germany. Well, they lied, Lee, and not only have they expanded 1 time, 2 times, they've expanded 14 times since the end of the First Cold War. They added 14 new members to NATO, all of which were east of Germany, all violating their promises. And several of those countries are on the borders of Russia. So Ukraine, NATO was talking about trying to add Ukraine right on the border of Russia to the US-led NATO military alliance. These are all direct threats. It's like if the US orchestrated a coup in Mexico involving neo-Nazis and extremists, and then they tried to add Mexico to a US military alliance, and then the US said, look, we need security guarantees. You can't surround us with military bases and hostile powers and then expect us to just act like everything is, peachy keen and normal. Russia demanded security guarantees, and the response of the United States and NATO was nada, nil, saying, sorry, we're not going to guarantee you anything.
He's breaking up because he's in Nicaragua. He lives in Nicaragua. And, yeah, so I just happened to do this one because Lee Camp has literally been, like, all day today, the left has been talking about his coverage of this. Because this whole time, he has not been blinded by the vid. He has not been blinded by one issue. And he's been paying attention to a broad stroke of things. And he started digging up, as soon as they started talking about Ukraine, he started digging up the Ukraine history, talking about the Nazis that, America has funded in the far east of Ukraine. They've been funding Nazis in that region for a very long time. And yeah, so this is definitely something that Lee knows well, and Ben is very good on a handful of subjects. So that's why I chose this to start.
That brought us to the situation today, and you never hear those mentioned in mainstream corporate media.
Right. This is an ongoing effort to kind of surround Russia with a military alliance, a U.S. military alliance, missiles that we've sent to Ukraine, other firepower that we've sent to Ukraine, pointed, on Russia's border, pointed at Russia. And then we act surprised that Russia, might do something in return or not be okay with this. It's kind of hilarious to act like, what? If you turn on CNN right now, they'd be like, this is crazy. Putin just decided to steal a country. Like, that would be the way they'd play it. When, like you say, there's this long-term lead up to this. And in this region, the Donbass region, there's basically been fighting ongoing since 2014. There was never a really holding ceasefire. There were, I saw numbers recently that they were averaging 200 violations of the ceasefire a day, and now it's up to like 1,000 a day. And like you said, these are Nazi-linked forces. I showed photos that have come out. I showed them on Redacted Night last week, but they have swastikas on their helmets. These aren't. It's not like top secret Nazis. This is in-your-face Nazis that the U.S. and the British. One of the photos that leaked out was British military higher-ups meeting with Ukrainian National Guard, which is Nazi-linked. And this is not really a secret. Like, you can read on Yahoo News about how the CIA has been helping fund and arm these Nazis so that they can exert attacks on Russian people.
Yeah, and you raise an important point of the Russian language and Russian ethnicity. Now, we need to understand that Ukraine is a diverse country. There are ethnic Ukrainians who speak the Ukrainian language, but then there are also ethnic Russians. There are even ethnic Hungarians and Poles. So in the eastern part of Ukraine, near the border of Russia, there is a Ukrainian national population that is Russian ethnically. They speak Russian. Culturally, they're Russian. And ever since the 2014 US-backed coup in Ukraine, their rights have been systematically violated. And this is very important because we've even seen laws passed by the central Ukrainian government in Kiev that said that all publications in the...
So I saw some people talking about that when Putin, cleared the Donetsk region or whatever, the Donetsk region, that was the initial form of war. And then I heard Lee Camp the very same day go, "Thank God somebody's finally done something with this region, because it has been at war for 8 years. It has been a war-torn region for 8 years, and has been just left in the blank, in the void."
The media have to be in the Ukrainian language. So we've seen massive violations of Russian-speaking Ukrainians' rights. We've seen Russian language media outlets have been shut down. We've seen politicians who speak Russian have been imprisoned. And there's a hardcore right-wing nationalist program of Ukrainianization of the country, which is very fascistic. And ironically, the current president, Zelensky, who is ironically of Jewish descent, and he's dealing with this government full of Nazis and extremists, he was elected and he won in a landslide, saying that he wanted a peace settlement. He wanted the conflict, the violence in the eastern Donbass region that began after the 2014 coup to end. And he spoke Russian during his campaign. But what happened is that even though he won on this pro-peace platform in a massive landslide, the Ukrainian people voted for him in a massive landslide, he came into office and he did a 180, because the reality is, as I said, the Ukrainian government is really a puppet government. It doesn't have control. Zelensky has been having these phone calls yelling with Joe Biden. Joe Biden is yelling at him, probably, saying corn pop, and told me that Putin's going to invade. I mean, the reality is that the Ukrainian government is not really able to govern. And this leader who was elected on a pro-peace platform was not able to implement peace because the U.S. has been using Ukraine and fighting to the last Ukrainian to push against Russia. And what are Washington's priorities? Well, it's very clear. Washington has been saying for weeks that it wants to justify...
Like, have they pulled his skin just so far up? What is happening with his face? I'm sorry, that's super just devoid of actual merit, but just look at what the heck. I've not seen it. Oh, man. Don't do close-ups on that guy.
Aggressive against Russia. And the irony of this, Lee, is that a lot of this isn't really about Ukraine. This is actually about Western Europe, and it's about Germany. The U.S. has been using this conflict, fueling the conflict, encouraging Ukraine to attack the eastern Donbass region, encouraging the Ukrainian military to aggressively shell and bombard the Donbass region, which we don't hear about in the media. And why? Because the U.S. was trying to turn up the heat in order to pressure Russia to take action, because then the U.S. could use that as justification to impose sanctions on Russia. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. The U.S. was provoking a crisis, creating a crisis, and when Russia was forced to respond out of self-defense, the U.S. says, now we're going to impose sanctions on Russian banks.
He doesn't get headaches from intelligence or from thoughts, that's for fucking sure. Guy can barely read, let alone put out a thought.
banks to prevent Russian banks from trading in dollars.
Right.
We're also going to impose sanctions to prevent the Nord Stream 2 pipeline with Germany from being certified, and that's exactly what we saw. This was the playbook, and it was played to a T.
I want to get back to the sanctions in a moment, but just to go back to what you said about how many in that region consider themselves Russian. Right now, there is tens of thousands of refugees flooding into Russia, leaving that area, and many of them consider themselves, like you said, Russian. And I read an interview. A reporter got on one of the buses of these people leaving that region and said, "How many of you have Russian passports? You know, are Russian citizens?" And half of the bus raised their hand, because this is a very Russian area. So, you know, and he interviewed one, you know, older man, and he said, you know, this border was thrust upon us. You know, we viewed ourselves as Russian, Soviet Union era, and all of a sudden a border shoved in our face, and we're told, no, we're Ukrainian now. And it's, you know, very complicated, yes, but it's not what we're being told in our mainstream media. But I also wanted to get back to the sanctions. This Nord Stream 2 pipeline was a massive undertaking between Russia and Germany, and would also deliver fossil fuels to elsewhere in Europe, but mainly between Germany and Russia. And it was going to change the oil dynamics in Europe and Russia and the U.S., and now the U.S. is an exporter of oil and gas, so we want Europe buying our oil and gas, even though it's far more expensive to ship it across an ocean than to have a pipeline from Russia. So we kind of needed to create a situation where we could stop that. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, of course, I'll preface by saying that, you know, you and I, Lee, both agree that the world needs to move toward renewables, but the reality is that there's still a long way to go, and although we should definitely take more action, if we want to be realistic, if you're a political policymaker, a politician in a capital like in Berlin, in Paris, you have to look at the situation on the ground. You have to say, look, we need energy to heat our houses, especially in the winter. The European winter is brutal, and we have to get that gas from somewhere. And the reality is that Russia is offering Germany and other countries in Western Europe very cheap gas. The U.S., on the other hand, is offering much more expensive gas. This, you know, people often say that wars are about oil, and many wars certainly are about oil. This is actually not really about oil, it's more about gas. So Russia is a major exporter of oil and gas, but a lot of these European countries rely on Russian gas exports, and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is a gas pipeline, and Germany imports, at least it used to, over half of its gas from Russia, which is used to heat houses. And the reality is that now that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline has been canceled, Germany is going to have to pay even more money for gas prices. And if you look at what's been happening in Europe in the past several months, the prices of of average citizens' electricity bills have skyrocketed. And that's because of this conflict over Ukraine, because there's been a decrease in the import of gas from Russia and an increase in the exports from the United States of gas to Europe. And of course, they're going across the ocean. They're much more expensive. The U.S. has actually, for the first time in history, in the past few months, become the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world, larger than Qatar, larger than Russia. So the U.S. has a vested interest, and fossil fuel corporations in the U.S. have a vested interest in keeping Europe dependent on their gas exports. They don't want them to be dependent on Russian gas exports. So a lot of this is about not just Russia, it's about Western Europe, and it's all about this new Cold War strategy in which the United States is trying to prevent Western Europe from economically integrating with Russia and by extension with China, because they can keep Europe dependent on US goods, on US energy, on US products, and they can keep Europe in many ways as a kind of colony in some ways of the U.S., keeping Western Europe under the U.S. sphere of influence. And ironically, we've seen that the Biden administration, Blinken, the Secretary of State, constantly criticizes Russia, saying the era of spheres of influence is over, telling that to Russia. But the reality is that the U.S. is acting as though Europe belongs to its own sphere of influence.
Yeah, I think a lot of this does seem to be the
sphere of influence. Our sphere of influence is freaking everywhere. It's legitimately everywhere. that much.
The U.S. still thinking we own the world and everything should basically belong to us in one way or another. Of course, there's so much we didn't get into on this topic, such as how hilarious it is for the U.S. to be telling another country what they can or can't do, considering the number of countries we invade or bomb or destroy. It's just an endless list. That is hilarious. But I think what you got to there at the end is another just major important point on this topic, is that this has to do with an entire change of the power dynamics around the globe, in that China has become a very powerful economy. Russia has gotten back on its feet since the 90s. And the U.S., meanwhile, we're in this late stage capitalism where we've decided to just abandon all of our average people. You've got millions homeless, millions who are, basically behind on their rent, could be evicted any day. And instead focus all of our energy and all of our money, $1 trillion a year, on basically bombing other countries to try and keep them under control.
Yeah, this goes back to 1992, at the end of the first Cold War, in which the Pentagon declared the so-called Wolfowitz Doctrine, in which it said that it will not tolerate the rise of any other competitor, any other geostrategic competitor, geopolitical rival. And now there's not one, but two: Russia and China. And we have to keep in mind, Lee, that when we're talking about Russia and China, we increasingly need to talk about them as partners, as allies. And the U.S. has said this very clearly in the National Defense Strategy released by the Pentagon, that it sees both of these countries as its competitors, or really its enemies, in the Cold War. So the conflict in Ukraine is in many ways also about China, just as the conflict over Taiwan is also about, because China and Russia are working together more and more. And the reality is that the U.S. is trying to divide the world, to carve up the world into new blocks of the new Cold War. We see this with Europe, where the U.S. is telling Europe, look, you have to unify with us and Australia and all these countries that, by the way, just so happen to be all the white countries, against China and against Russia. And meanwhile, in the Pacific region, the U.S. has created this new alliance called the Quad, and the U.S. just held a meeting of the Quad, which consists of the U.S., Australia, Japan, and India. And this is basically an anti-China alliance to try to contain China and wage the new Cold War on China. So all of these things that are happening are part of this new Cold War. And ultimately, it's about the U.S. maintaining control of the world, and specifically about U.S. corporations maintaining control of the world, as they did in the 1990s. We can look at the policies they did to Russia, the horrible neoliberal shock therapy program they imposed on Russia that led to life expectancies decreasing, that led to the standards of living dropping. And Ukraine is actually an unfortunate example of this. We can go full circle here. Ukraine is the only country of the former Soviet Union that has never been able to reach the same economic level of GDP and standard of living that it did in 1991. And this is the example that the U.S. is showing the entire world of what it wants as an alternative. It's not an alternative. The reality is that, as you said, Lee, there's mass homelessness, mass poverty growing in the United States. Nearly 1 million people in the United States have died of COVID. And the U.S. wants to impose this model on the rest of the world. And we can see in Ukraine that this model that the U.S. imposed has been a complete disaster.
Yep.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, they also want to believe that we are our nation states, even though, the 99% of us who are not the rich ruling class have more in common with your average person in another country than we have with their rich ruling class. This is a bunch of rich assholes who want to stop a lot of people from coming together, working together, creating a better world, one where we actually deal with climate change rather than ignoring it, etc. But anyway, Ben, I'm sorry we ran out of time, but I highly recommend everybody check out multipolarista.com, and thanks again.
Thanks for having me, Lee. It was a great show.
I don't know the whole story, guys. I am a fan of Ben Norton. He does great work, a lot of good journalism. He has left. I heard. I don't know if this was a Twitter. I can't remember if this was a Twitter war or what this was, but he left the Gray Zone And supposedly it was over his lockdown left beliefs, which, if that's actually the case, that him and Max butted heads over the opinion of COVID, then that's again what I would call cancel culture that we don't need to be doing. We don't need to be promoting because yes, everybody needs to stop canceling people. um, if you can agree with, just disagree with people. I want to do you first. All right, coming up on the weekend, guys. So the Stand with Ukraine, Stop Putin rally. Like, I mean, it is just. I looked at the rally list a couple days ago, and since this morning, Houston has a rally, Washington D.C. has a rally. Um, where's that? South Carolina doesn't say what city on the basics of it. British Columbia, Minnesota. Oh, they actually have an Protect Our Babies anti-violence rally. So most of these are all the Ukraine stuff. New York, Alberta, in Florida. There's actually a bunch of don't say gay and stuff. The whole DeSantis gay freaking bill in the state right now is causing a bit of an uproar. So in Florida there is, oh shit, I kind of want to know this because I have Saturday off. Couple hours to a rally, honestly. I need a lot of shit. Ooh, downtown Sarasota. Oh, that's freaking a million miles away. That might as well. I mean, it's season here, so 100 miles will be a million miles because it's impossible to get anywhere. I would love to go this if it was off season and I can get down there. But this is one of the two sites that I get emails from. So I'm not sure if the other one. Rally for Our Collective Rights. That's the anti-LGBTQ. So that one I think is Don't Say Gay bill. That one's in Orlando. Which one's this one? So there's several protesting against. This one's Orlando. It'd be too easy if it was just Indiana. Family's first day at the state house. I don't know what that means. But there's a lot of protests this weekend, guys. Tons of protests for us to participate in. Mostly against the war. A lot of peace, a lot of peace protests, a lot of anti-war protests. And I saw this one was from yesterday, today, whatever you want to call it, still, whatever time zone you are. Just crossed over midnight here, so to yesterday for me. But this was from Haiti. You want to check this out? Haiti's police opened fire during a protest. Oh, well, luckily they don't show the shooting because that would have been a little too intense for me. Uh, so that is, Haiti's got protests going on right now against their minimum wage, their slave wages down there. They pay like 16 cents an hour. That was part of Clinton's farewell tour. She made sure that they didn't get any living wages down there. I thought there was. Oh, this is still freaking. Um, there's one other protest I wanted to check out, but it was on my updated list. Here we go. These are the new protests today. New round of protesting today is all covered by America. So before this even crosses, it's really entertaining to me that protests are so hard, like so rarely covered by mainstream media. And when they do cover it, like Fox will cover Black Lives Matter, but they'll only cover the actual violence parts of it. They won't cover the fact that 99% of it was peaceful. When the left covers a protest like today, they're covering it from the fact that there's people protesting in Russia against war. Now they'll never show Americans protesting against war. They'll
had the support of the Russian people to launch a massive and bloody invasion of Ukraine. Well, here are his people protesting in the streets of Moscow just today under the threat of arrest. They openly defied Vladimir Putin and demanded peace. They're chanting, "No more war." And this is St. Petersburg, hundreds of miles away. As expected and true to historical pattern, police in riot gear cracked down on the war protesters and dragged demonstrators away in cuffs. A Russian human rights monitor reports the police arrested more than 1,600 protesters across Russia. NBC's Matt Bodner live in Moscow for us tonight. Matt, what have you been seeing and hearing there on the ground?
A dark and I'd say bewildered mood set upon Moscow this morning as Russians, for the first time, woke up to the news and faced the reality of a war that their president has been preparing more or less in plain sight for months. A war, by the way, that almost every Russian insisted was impossible because they are brother nations. The Kremlin insisting that it has public support, but we are seeing signs that that is not necessarily true. It is, of course, too soon to kind of get a full understanding of where the Russian public will fall on this, but we saw protests break out throughout the country today, including here in Moscow, a heavy security presence. Across 53 cities, 1,700 protesters were arrested. These are big numbers historically for Russian protests and kind of give you a sense of the scale of it, but I have to say it is still a much smaller arrest number than we saw essentially 1 year ago when people took to the streets to protest the arrest of the opposition leader, Alexei Navalny. Speaking of Alexei Navalny, he was on trial again today from his prison where he's being held, and he used it as an opportunity to speak out against the war, saying that this is essentially a way for the government to cover up what he says is the ongoing robbery of Russia's future from Russian citizens, saying that only Russians and Ukrainians will pay the price for the regime's war in Ukraine. Now,
Публичное мероприятие проводится с нарушением требований федерального закона номер 54 о собраниях, митингах, демонстрациях, шествиях и пикетированиях. Участие в несогласованном в установленном законом порядке в публичном мероприятии вы будете задержаны и доставлены в территориальный орган внутренних дел. Уважаемые представители СМИ. Все, на исходную. Позор! За что? Нет войне! Нет войне! Нет войне! Нет войне! Нет войне!
We'll start fighting. Exciting podcast for you. Today's podcast is a rebuttal. It is a further clarifying of a former podcast that we did. Our guest today, very exciting, Stephanie Kelton and Rowan Gray. They are some of the authorities on what's called modern monetary theory, which is kind of a new approach to economics.
First, thank you. For inviting both of us to come and talk to you about
I'm delighted.
this.
All right, so let me roll it back then, and we'll start a little bit at my interest in this. I did an interview with a gentleman named Thomas Honig, who I guess was chairman of the KC Fed, and he had been voting no on quantitative easing from the Fed, which is their policy of pumping a good deal of money into the economy. And he and I had a spirited discussion where I, without the knowledge of economics or the language of economics or the verbiage of economics, was trying to understand why the Fed can just bring this money cannon to corporate America and not also maybe let, as we say in the old neighborhood, let the people have a taste. Have a little taste, a little something from the money cannon. I guess I'm confused as if we can print money. You just said we're the only.
We can buy an asset,
Okay.
any asset, by printing money. That is,
But you can't pay debt by printing money.
You can buy debt by printing money.
So what
Or
if we
you-
just buy
or
back
you-
our debt?
Well, because all you're doing is
I feel like you're having trouble. It's like talking to a monkey.
No,
You're
no.
like talking to a monkey
No,
and trying
no,
to
no,
figure out
look
how
at-
do I communicate with this monkey?
No, no,
I don't
no.
know what to do.
no. I totally get it's confusing.
And Stephanie and Rowan were lovely enough to comment on it on the internet in a long chat form, which made me think that neither of you has a fulfilling life, because this is the part, now we get to it. How did any of this come to your attention, and explain to me how this came about?
So I listened to the podcast and I'm on Twitter. Rowan's on Twitter,
Okay.
and there was quite a bit of chatter about this. You guys pushed some buttons, but you didn't push the buttons that were pushed for me and I think for Rowan.
We were on the wrong buttons.
No. I think that a lot of the interest in some of the commentary was surrounding, the potential impact of the Fed's quantitative easing program on inequality. But I wanted to take up a different part of the conversation. And I listened to the whole podcast, and then I felt very sad. And,
Wow, that's our goal. Anytime you can listen to the whole podcast and feel sad, I've done my job.
Misery loves company. So I reached out to Rowan and I said, I feel very sad and I would like you to experience the sadness with me. Would you listen to it together?
I'm going to give you guys a chance to unsadden yourselves by telling me what I was getting wrong there and where you thought the conversation should have gone. What was it that saddened you both as you were listening to me talk about Fed policy with Thomas Honig?
Well, I don't think it was so much listening to you. It was the missed opportunity of what you could have potentially pulled out of him had he given you, I think, more candid answers, frankly, to the questions. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think the starting point is that we often think of the Fed as the sort of only institution in the federal government that has any monetary firepower, right? It's the sort of printing press. It's the one that can do anything in a crisis. But the reality is, and I think COVID has done a great job of demonstrating this, that it's the fiscal firepower. It's the budget side of things that really has the power to actually save, real people's incomes, save industries, to invest. And one of the big questions is, if we accept that we can do things with the budget and we should be, what is the role of the Fed and how do they relate to each other? And when it comes to things like protecting financial markets from having a liquidity crisis or regulating financial institutions, yeah, it makes sense the Federal Reserve might be the place you look to. But when you look at what the Fed is doing, when we say the sort of Fed injected trillions of dollars into the economy, one of the things that it's doing is buying up assets. So the first thing to think about is there's always two assets involved. There's the sort of money that goes in, and there's whatever's coming back out going to the Fed. So if somebody said to me, hey, you've got trillions of dollars, but all you can do is buy
Of that orthodoxy. And the reason why I ask it is you talked about this debt, right?
Right.
To me, and clearly I'm a layman and don't understand the intricacies of it, it feels made up. That this monetary policy feels like a delusion of some sort. And why couldn't they just cancel that debt and have the country carry less and then tighten the policy where it would be less? If you raise interest rates and on big debt, right? Then we've got all this pressure on making those payments. And why not have the Fed cancel the debt and then raise interest rates to reset the playing field?
Well, the difficulty with that is, of course, this is debt owed by the government. And so now you're going to you have this debt, and you're just going to say, I don't owe it anymore.
Where Tom Honig did not meet you where you were at. He sort of said, oh, it's very complicated, you silly little boy. But I think the reality is you are identifying a real question, which is, if the The Fed can swap treasury debt for money, and it basically has very little effect.
And it can print money.
The Treasury is printing the Treasury debt, and the Fed is printing the money to buy up the Treasury's printed
Correct.
debt. It's like mum issues like IOU, and then dad takes it out and then gives you cash from your wallet. What's the actual thing going on there? What's the effect on the economy? And Tom says, well, if you understand it like I do, because I'm a very serious economist, remember, then all you're doing is swapping one kind of government IOU for another. Money is an IOU, Treasury debt is an IOU. Therefore, all we're doing is swapping yellow for green. It's exactly the same. And on one level, he's not wrong. He's not 100%
Okay.
wrong. But on the other side, you are not wrong either, which is there a difference between treasury debt and money? Yes. Is that difference quite small at an economic level, the way that Tom was saying? Yes. But is it big at a social level, at a political level? As you were saying, absolutely. So if we have trillions of dollars of government debt out there, people hold that as money. You ask Goldman Sachs what's in their cash account, they'll think you're talking about treasury debt. Because for them, treasury debt is money. So if you're swapping treasury debt for dollars, it's like taking money from your savings account and putting it in your checking account. Do you have less money? No. But from a political point of view, from a cultural point of view, you've solved the national debt. We've solved our grandchildren's crisis.
That was the point
We've
I was
solved
trying
the
to
borrowing
make.
from China.
So I was trying to ask him, who holds our debt? He said, well, China holds our debt, all these other.
You can't just stop paying on the debt.
No, but couldn't you just quantitative ease our debt? What's the difference of making that money available to Goldman Sachs as it is to making that money available to China? Only one would lessen our debt. You just print that money and pay debt. If this is money that we've created out of thin air anyway, what's to stop us from creating I used to make fun of Paul Krugman for his idea of $1 trillion coin, and now I feel myself saying, hey man, well, let's just get $10 trillion coins, give one to China, one to Europe. Are we square? Good. And then we start again, because this whole thing seems manufactured. Swap it for them for the debt. And then at the very least, we now we've bought back our mortgage. So now we can never foreclose on it. Even if interest rates go up, we have a lot more control over our debt. Does that make sense?
I mean, I think one of the most important things you were trying to get at with him was the idea that this thing we call the national debt, and this is Rowan's point, we have yellow paper and green paper. We have dollars and we have treasuries, but they're thought of very differently. We don't think of the green paper as debt conventionally, but we think of the yellow paper, the government bonds, treasuries as debt.
And that's what the Fed is buying. They're buying treasuries, they're buying bonds. They're buying debt.
Yeah, in Tom's mind, they're the same, because he thinks up at that central bank level. So for him, they're just different liabilities on a balance sheet. But down with us, with the public, these are entirely different worlds. Do you know the stock of public money in circulation, John? How many people know that? There's the national debt counter. Right. There's no national money counter underneath. Nobody's counting that.
And they're increasing that supply by $120 billion a month. Still.
Yeah, no grandchildren involved. No China involved. No bond markets involved.
It reminds me of the way our government says you need to pay for. So anytime we have a crisis or something crucial that the public needs, the government will say, I'm sorry, we have discretionary spending. It's this amount. If you want to add to that, we either have to take it away from somebody else or create a pay for. Okay. Well, also we want to go to war. Oh, okay. So what's our pay for? Yeah, that we're not going to have a pay for. What do you mean? Yeah, we're just
freedom pays for itself.
That we're just going to put out there and we're going to pay for it, but we're not going to, that's going to be just debt that we don't even think about. We don't add it to anything. It just is. And that's the part that seems like, well, you just get to decide then what goes on our budget and what's just air. That's the part that I was trying to figure out.
That's the politics. And you're exactly right. And the way that I usually try to say it is, there's all this conversation about finding the money. We want to have healthcare, childcare, or we want to have a Build Back Better agenda and all the rest of it. Say, how are you going to pay for it? Where will you find the money? And I always try to say, look, if the votes are there, the money is there, because the votes are what kick the money out. So just as you said, every time the Defense Authorization Act comes up every year, they kick the money out. There's no hand wringing. They don't pause to have a big debate or discussion. Manchin doesn't stand up and say, wait a minute, I'm concerned about grandchildren.
No pay for, no nothing.
Almost all United States senators, it's the most bipartisan thing they do, is vote for the defense authorization each year. And not only that, they say, how much did the Pentagon request? Oh, we feel extra generous today. We want you to have $20 billion more
They gave them
than you asked
another
for.
$20 billion. Meanwhile,
Always.
We're trying to get veterans health care from exposure to burn pits. You cannot believe the shit they're putting these guys through for pay-fors, for other. They're going to cheap them on the back end. It's as though that's not part of the cost of war. It's crazy. Yeah. And I'm just talking about the Fed. And maybe it's not their purview or anybody else, but why can't they do $120 billion of municipal bonds for infrastructure? If you're just buying bonds and debt and treasuries, Why not buy infrastructure? Why not use that money rather than just to keep banks hoarding cash? Why not put it to use?
Many years ago, I went to Washington, D.C. at the request of Republican Congressman Ray LaHood, who went on to become Transportation Secretary, right, Illinois.
Yep.
And LaHood wanted to do exactly what you just said. I mean, the man really wanted to invest in America's crumbling infrastructure, make these investments. And he said, we ought to use the Fed, and the Fed ought to be buying these bonds at effectively zero interest rate and facilitating the financing and so forth. And a colleague of mine, Randy Ray, and I, we wrote something about this. And then I was asked to go to D.C. and meet with officials at the Fed and walk them through and talk about how this would all work. And so I went. I got to sit in Alan Greenspan's chair. We had a lovely chat, but at the end of the day, they said to me, we prefer to see it go through Congress. And I said, but it's kind of being 6 of one, half a dozen of the other in these ways that I showed them through the balance sheet entries and so forth. And they said, well, we prefer the half a dozen to the 6 because one keeps us out of it and the other one integrates us into this process. It explicitly says the Fed is now financing other kinds of things and they don't want any part of it.
Yeah, there's a big commitment at the Fed to not be seen as picking winners or losers, which is why in COVID, when they did for the first time establish this municipal lending facility, they hated it. It was barely used. They made it so difficult that only 1 or 2 states and municipalities actually took advantage of it. To go to your early question, I think there is a little bit of a difference between government, federal treasury debt and state and local debt in the sense that the federal government's debt is guaranteed by the same full faith and credit as the US dollar. So it really is almost the difference between a large denomination bill and a small denomination bill. With these others, you're sort of picking up the tab for state and local governments, which is a good thing.
But isn't the other side of it too, though, that state and local governments can't run a deficit in the way that the federal government can. Exactly. So if the Fed were going to do that, it would actually be more impactful and it would allow it because so much of the federal spending is really to cover holes that exist within state and local municipal funding.
If you asked federal Congress, members of Congress, whether or not New York City should run its own defense force. I mean, putting aside the size of New York NYPD, they'd say, no, that's a federal job. It's too important to be left to local
National
governments.
security, for God's sakes.
Well, then why not for infrastructure? Why not for education? When the answer to
Healthcare.
why there's something unique about the federal government, it has the power of the purse.
Right.
It has that printing press. We're all using that system, right? It's their world. We just live in it.
So here's where we get into where I thought this is sort of the difference and a very basic understanding I have of supply side economics and demand side economics. And I'll explain it as best I can without knowing what I'm talking about, which is how I do things. All right. We've had supply side economics for, 40 years. And in the last probably 15 years, really hyped up with the Fed pumping a tremendous amount of liquidity into it, keeping interest rates down. It's basically just inflating larger assets at the high level. You're saying to people, saving your money means nothing, but investing it in the stock market or in real estate is everything. If you keep interest rates low and people can't get 4%, 5%, 6% on savings, their only choice is the stock market or real estate or something else. And generally, money is flowing in there and inflating it. The dividends and the buybacks and all those other things that are occurring are creating more and more inequality. Now, supply side economics would say, and that's going to trickle down and create economic growth and development, right? $1.9 trillion tax cut, 0% interest rates, total deregulation. And what did we gain in GDP or median income? Very little. And inflation doesn't do anything. So basically, all that supply side money doesn't seem to stimulate the economy in any way. Now, the pandemic occurs and we go, just fucking give everybody $600. The economy goes 10%, 12% growth. Suddenly, inflation's a problem. It makes you think we could have been growing the economy with far less artillery and keeping an eye. It's only when workers get money that inflation becomes a problem. Explain to me in economic terms what I just said, and then grade me, and then just tell me if I'm going into the next year's class.
All right. So what you're talking about are the two different policy levers. The fiscal policy lever is what you described, giving people money, using Congress to pass legislation, what we just did. The thing you started with is monetary policy.
Correct.
It's the central bank. It's the buying of assets. It's the zero interest rate policy and all the rest. And the deregulation and the tax cuts, that's all very Thatcher, Reagan, supply side trickle down. So you're quite right. We have done this. We have run this experiment over and over again for some 40 years or so. The evidence is in, and not just here in the US, but around the world. It does not work. It does work. I think some might say as it's designed to work, which is to widen income and wealth inequality.
Right.
But what it also does, by shoveling all of the gains to the people at the very top, who, by the way, don't tend to turn around and spend that money back into the economy, it gives us a slower growing, just crappier economy where fewer and fewer people get ahead. Wage pressure isn't there because the labor market never runs really hot, because the economy never really runs close to its, kind of potential. And so we have relied on central banks to basically steer the economic ship. You guys figure it out. You use your interest rates and your, what did you call it, Rumpelstiltskin skills,
Your alchemy.
and you take care of it. Yeah, your alchemy. And fiscal policy, we're just going to worry about trying to keep deficits down and all of that sort of stuff. So it is, in large part, the reluctance to use that fiscal policy lever and to leave all of the responsibility to the central bank to try to engineer some kind of economic growth. And what do they have? They have an interest rate tool. That's the primary tool. So they do what they can, which is lower and lower interest rate, which, if it works, John, monetary policy works by driving people into debt, because the purpose of cutting interest rates is to induce the rest of us to borrow and spend. Whereas fiscal policy works by driving income into people. Like you said, $600, here you go. You own it free and clear, and you don't have to pay it back. So they work very differently. They serve different constituencies.
But Stephanie, the economy, they say 70% of the American economy is consumer spending. Why would you stimulate it at the 15% of the economy when 70% of it is driven by spending? You could stimulate that with such a smaller gun.
When you were talking about low interest rates causing inequality, and you mentioned savers and people needing a place to put their retirement money, and I think this is a really important point, because when you and I think of high interest rates, it's a sort of double-edged sword, right? On one hand, our savings account is maybe earning more or things like that, but on the other side, our mortgage is higher, or our credit card interest rate is higher, or something like that. And so there are ways around the world, I'm from Australia, there are ways where you can create public pension systems, public savings for consumers. But what we have right now is a system where if you want to pay a higher rate for, mum and pop savers, retirees, those kinds of things, you also have to pay a higher interest rate on all of the hedge funds, all of the other investment funds that hold treasury debt. And so you have this hostage situation where low rates are seen to be the cause of A, inequality, and B, starving savers and pensioners from their money. Whereas the reality is we should have high rates for them, but maybe zero rates on all those investment vehicles.
And there's no stipulation. So
no, there's no distinction between the two. It's not pension bonds and non-pension bonds. It's just bonds, and a lot of them are held by investors who are not.
And I'll give you an example. This easy money policy is what allowed the American airline industry to become flush with cash. And so during the time, this is after 2008, they become flush with cash. They do a ton of stock buybacks just to kind of re-enrich their shareholders. And then the pandemic hits and they don't have the cash on hand. So we've subsidized their golden parachutes, but not the industry that we rely on for transportation.
So I think the really difficult line to try to draw is not to say we should just throw interest rates super high, because that can put people out of into bankruptcy from debt and things. But we do want to not have that easy money that you're talking about. So how can we put tighter financial conditions, more restrictions on Wall Street, more restrictions on these big companies?
So if the idea is we can print money when we need it, but the only time we ever use that is when the financial system or the big banks need it. It's the only time we'll really print it is for them. In this pandemic, we did it on a more Keynesian level, and suddenly inflation ran amok. Again, putting labor over a barrel, which is to say, see, we tried, we gave you guys a little money, and look what happened. It doesn't take into account the externalities of supply chain problems in a pandemic. It doesn't take into account that we never got ahead of, we never planned for that influx of money. So it kind of had nowhere to go other than consumer spending. So how do you battle the perception, at least, that when you do have a more Keynesian approach, it immediately destroys commodities like gas, groceries, and everything else that the people who are struggling rely on in the first place?
So one thing is, you look around the world and you see countries that did far less than the United States. We had a tremendous response in terms of fiscal policy, right, to deal with the pandemic and the economic fallout. About $5 trillion from March of 2020 to March of 2021 was committed through Congress. So you see all these countries that didn't go anywhere close to where we've gone. Germany has inflation running at a 40-year high. China has inflation running at a near 40-year high. So, and these are the things that you're talking about: energy prices, supply chain bottlenecks, the problems related to the shutting down and reopening of different parts of the economy at different times. These are kind of the inevitable growth pains.
So the correlation is not causation in this case.
That's exactly right. But you're right to say, you know, that there's a real risk that Keynesian economic policy and that the policy response this time, which was so much better than the policy response after 2008, will come away with a real black eye if people don't get a better understanding of why the inflation is up at the moment. If we start pointing our fingers and saying, well, this is what happens when you try to help people stay in their homes and be attached to their employers and have some income to pay the bills, can't do that ever again. This was the punishment. Can't let that happen.
If you think about where the inflation is showing up, you know, one of the things to look at is where are the real resources there otherwise potentially being deployed. So if somebody comes to a bank and says, I want to build a school, that's going to need laborers, it's going to need bricks, it's going to need other things. Say there's somebody else in the next booth at the bank and says, I want to build a casino. It's the same labor, it's the same bricks, it's the same electrical engineers, etc. Now, we don't have a mechanism today to work out where we should put the blame between a private loan, private credit, and public spending. We say, oh, look, we spent a lot of money on school building, and now there's inflation in construction. It must be the schools. Meanwhile, all those casinos being built next door get off scot-free because that's not taking place on the government's balance sheet. Right. So when we look at demand, we need to look at all the sources of demand, not just the public's balance sheet. Otherwise, we're always inevitably going to blame the one thing that we changed this time. And of course, no one's saying we need to cut military spending by a third, right? That's not the part of the budget they're going to blame at the end of this. Right. They're going to blame helping average people. If it's that we have the resources, but right now private actors are hoarding them or using them in private markets and they're not available for public use, we need to make them available.
You know, it always strikes me that when you talk about
things. Say there's somebody else in the next booth at the bank and says, I want to build a casino. It's the same labor, it's the same bricks, it's the same electrical engineers, etc. Now,
of why the inflation is up at the moment. If we start pointing our fingers and saying, well, this is what happens when you try to help people stay in their homes and be attached to their employers and have some income to pay the bills, can't do that ever again. This was the punishment. Can't let that happen.
If you think about where the inflation is showing up, you know, one of the things to look at is where are the real resources there otherwise potentially being deployed. So if somebody comes to a bank and says, I want to build a school, that's going to need laborers, it's going to need bricks, it's going to need other things. Say there's somebody else in the next booth at the bank and says, I want to build a casino. It's the same labor, it's the same bricks, it's the same electrical engineers, etc. Now, we don't have a mechanism today to work out where we should put the blame between a private loan, private credit, and public spending. We say, oh, look, we spent a lot of money on school building, and now there's inflation in construction. It must be the schools. Meanwhile, all those casinos being built next door get off scot-free because that's not taking place on the government's balance sheet. Right. So when we look at demand, we need to look at all the sources of demand, not just the public's balance sheet. Otherwise, we're always inevitably going to blame the one thing that we changed this time. And of course, no one's saying we need to cut military spending by a third, right? That's not the part of the budget they're going to blame at the end of this. Right. They're going to blame helping average people. If it's that we have the resources, but right now private actors are hoarding them or using them in private markets and they're not available for public use, we need to make them available.
You know,
Okay, back by popular demand. If he decides he's not going to be an economic expert anymore, he might have a future in our business or in the press office. So Dilip is back. He's going to give some brief comments at the top, take a few questions, then we'll do some briefing after then. And I'll just say at the top for anyone who needs to leave for TV, feel free to go. It's all fine. I will turn it over to Dilip now.
Thank you, Jen. Good to see all of you again, but this is a briefing I never wanted to give. I'd like to start by saying the prayers of the entire world are with the people of Ukraine today as they suffer an unjustified, unprovoked and premeditated attack by the Russian military forces. President Biden has said from the start of this crisis, if Putin chooses to invade, the cost to Russia will be immediate and profound. To its financial system, to its economy,
We're doing this
to
on
its
cartoon
technology
mode.
base, and to its strategic position in the world. As the world has now witnessed, Putin has made his choice. He rejected diplomacy and chose war. And today, the president.
Oh no, it showed my thing was gone. I'm gonna put this on 1 1/4 because it's long, but it was on everything today, so I guess we have to check it out, right? I did want to cut. Yep. Oh, they did cut it out. When I watched it, it was an hour 22. I did want to watch Biden as well, but
The president has announced our response. Because of Putin's choices, his
just
flagrant
skip him.
violation of international law, and his utter disregard for the principles that underpin peace and security across the world, we will now ensure his decision is remembered as a strategic failure. Today, we impose an unprecedented package of financial sanctions and export restrictions in lockstep with our allies and partners.
I just don't care about him.
Okay, I know it's late, but we will get to as many people as possible. I just wanted to note a couple of things at the top for all of you. One, USAID put out an announcement that they've deployed a DART, or Disaster Assistance Response Team, to respond to humanitarian needs in Ukraine. This DART team, which is currently based in Poland, is working closely with European allies and partners who will be on the front lines of the response. The team will lead the U.S. government's humanitarian response to help address critical needs caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The DART comprises 17 disaster experts from USAID who are assessing the situation, identifying priority needs to scale up assistance inside Ukraine, and working with partners to provide rapidly needed assistance to communities affected by the conflict. I know a number of you have also asked me, and we've tried to provide as much detail as possible about how the president has spent his time over the last period since last evening. I think we put out a few details, but just to reiterate for all of you, he closely monitored the events on the ground from both the Oval Office and then back in the residence over the course of last evening. We put out a few details last night, including the fact that he spoke repeatedly with his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan. He also spoke with his U.S. UN ambassador, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, before she gave that powerful speech at the UN last night. He received a briefing from Secretary Austin, Chairman Milley, Secretary Blinken, and his national security advisor around 11 p.m. approximately last evening as well. And as you know, he also spoke with President Zelensky. He continued to monitor closely into the wee hours last night. This morning, as you all know, he met for just about an hour with his national security team, which included both a full table in the room and full members from the cabinet, from the national security team on the screen. During that meeting, as is standard, he received an update from, of course, Defense, Intel, his diplomatic team about the status on the ground, and he has, of course, remained closely engaged with them through the course of the day. As you know, he also had a G7 meeting that lasted a couple of hours this morning, and he also spent an hour this afternoon on the phone with the leaders in Congress, Democratic and Republican leaders in Congress, briefing them on the situation on a secure call, briefing them on the situation on the ground, answering questions they had as well. So that has been his day to date, and he is continuing, of course, to focus on other priorities as president. But why don't we go to you, Zeke?
Thanks, Jen. Just picking up on that, has the president made any additional foreign leader calls today? Has he spoken to President Zelensky since their call last meeting?
There's not been another call to President Zelensky. I expect, as you have seen over the past several days, he will continue to have calls with leaders. We will keep you abreast as those happen.
And with the U.S. government saying that it believes that the Russian objective right now is to decapitate the Ukrainian government, does the U.S. believe that President Zelensky at this moment is safe?
We're not going to get into security questions, but we are in touch with President Zelensky, and we are working to provide him a range of support.
And President Zelensky, in addition to calling...
Of course you are. He's your puppet. Why wouldn't you support him?
For the West to cut Russia off from SWIFT, and also proposed or called for, demanded, I think was the word he used in a tweet, that the U.S. And its allies impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine. I know the president has said that he won't put U.S. boots on the ground in Ukraine to fight Russia. Is Ukrainian airspace in place? Is that something that is subject to any discussions?
We've certainly seen his tweet or his request via tweet, but I don't have an update on that request.
I think that's not off the table. No-fly zone's not off the table.
Again, I don't have any update on this point in time or status of the discussion. Go ahead.
Thanks. Just a follow-up on troops fast and a few cyber questions. Sure. Do you expect NATO to call the major response force, and how many U.S. troops could be called to help in that effort?
That's really up to NATO. As you know, we have a number of troops, thousands of troops that are on call, but that is a decision made by the NATO alliance.
And the president said, if Putin pursues cyber attacks against our companies, our critical infrastructure, we are prepared to respond. So just clarifying, does that first mean that there has not been any evidence of any cyber attack from Russia against any American companies at this point?
Not that we have identified or attributed at this point in time.
And can you explain?
I mean, aside from past ones that you were thoroughly tracking.
Yeah, I guess I mean in the last 24 hours.
I understand.
Can you explain more of the White House's thinking on kind of this debate in Washington about whether a cyber attack against a NATO ally would trigger an Article 5 response, a response from the alliance?
That, again, is up to the NATO alliance to determine, but obviously a cyber attack does constitute an attack, so that would certainly be a point of discussion among the NATO members.
Okay, one more really fast. On the USAID disaster response you just mentioned, a 17-person team. Is that enough? I mean, we're talking about, we've heard you guys talk about the potential of hundreds of thousands of refugees.
You're absolutely right, and I think that's an important point. But what we're trying to do here is provide any incremental update on the status of what our work is. And I'll just note, and you may be fully aware of this, but in terms of humanitarian assistance, we have been the biggest provider of humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. We've provided over $52 million in humanitarian assistance to Ukraine in the past year. Over the past few weeks, we've committed additional funding and supplies to humanitarian organizations. There's been a specific need and therefore a focus on support services, food, clean water, hygiene, shelter, trauma, primary health care, and we're prepared to certainly provide a significant amount more. So this is just one step, obviously less than 24 hours after the events of last night, and we will continue to plus up from here. Go ahead.
Jen, there are a number of protests within Russia itself. Are you monitoring this? What's your message to them?
Well, there certainly are, and I know with everything going on, this may not have caught everybody's attention, but let me just note that, today we're seeing Russian people in the streets, open letters from leading Russian journalists and cultural figures denouncing President Putin's war of choice, and reports of Russian mothers concerned about the reckless deployment of their sons to this fratricidal war. I think it's important to remember back in 2014 when they didn't even acknowledge that they were sending Russian soldiers. They didn't even acknowledge when there were body bags coming back from Ukraine into Russia. And there is an outcry in the streets by Russian people, by more Russian people than I think many would expect. So despite Putin's crackdown at home, dissenting views remain. And I think that's important to note. To publicly protest against President Putin and his war is a deeply courageous act. Their actions show the world that despite the Kremlin's propaganda, there are Russian people who profoundly disagree with what he is doing in Ukraine.
One more. Speaker Pelosi's talking about sending $600 million in lethal aid to Ukraine. Is this something you support?
We are in conversations with Congress, and I mentioned the president spoke with leaders just earlier this afternoon. I don't have an exact number, but those are ongoing conversations about what needs the Ukrainians have on the ground in a variety of categories: security, humanitarian, other economic assistance. Go ahead.
Does the U.S. have any analysis to indicate that there is dissent or division within Putin's government, or is it your understanding that Putin's government is united in this war?
It's an interesting question, and I mean, without getting into intelligence, which obviously we look at, I mentioned obviously Russians protesting in the streets. That's not exactly what you asked about, but if you watched the meeting the President Putin had with members of his national security team the other day, it was quite striking, the back and forth he had with his intel chief in that meeting. The analysis of that is certainly can be done in an open source manner, given it was quite public, but I will leave outside analysis to give further assessment of that.
And as you know, we are seeing Ukrainians start to flee the country. Yeah. Is the U.S. prepared to accept Ukrainian refugees?
We are, but we certainly expect that most, if not the majority, will want to go to Europe in neighboring countries. So we are also working with European countries on what the needs are, where there is capacity. Poland, for example, where we are seeing an increasing flow of refugees over the last 24 hours, or flow of individuals, I should say, out of Ukraine, what their needs are, and we've been talking and engaging with Europeans about that for some time now.
What part of what you're doing is to prepare for the United States to accept?
The president is certainly prepared for that, but I would just note that because there are a number of European countries neighboring Ukraine who have expressed an openness to it, we would anticipate many of them would want to go to European countries.
And just one more quick question. The president, of course, has repeatedly said that American troops will not enter Ukraine. Yeah. Is there any scenario that's been discussed where that decision might be reconsidered?
The president has no intention of sending U.S. troops to fight in Ukraine. That has not changed. Go ahead.
This was asked of the president earlier, but I don't think we got a full answer. Yesterday, Vladimir Putin said that he warned if others are involved of such consequences that you have never encountered in your history. Does the U.S. understand that as a threat of using nuclear weapons?
Well, we can't obviously get into the mind of President Putin as much as he said that, nor do we know all the specific details about his strategic posture, but we don't see any increased threat in that regard at this point in time. Go ahead.
Just to follow up on some of the cyber questions.
Sure.
I know that you and others have talked about how the government is on alert for the potential of a cyber attack, but can you share, are there any specific steps that are being taken that you can share that the U.S. is doing to protect the infrastructure, power grid, U.S. banks?
Well, I would say, one, there's been efforts that have been ongoing for some time, since the beginning of the administration, to harden the private sector, or work with the private sector in partnership to harden their cybersecurity protections. We've actually seen a great deal of progress made in the financial sector. It's one of the stronger sectors in terms of protections from a cyber front that we see out there. So it's been ongoing for several months. Obviously, when they're I'm just not in a position to get into more details at this point.
Stupid question. If the worst happens and Russia either reduces the flow of natural gas or cuts off energy altogether to Europe, does the administration have a good idea for how long households in Europe could last under that kind of circumstance?
No such thing as stupid questions, just stupid people. You're just asking the same. Like I feel like an AI randomized questionnaire would be better than these people.
I don't have an assessment of that from here. I can certainly check with our economic team. One thing I will say that one of the steps we've been taking, obviously natural gas shortages and supply is an enormous regional issue, one that would hugely impact Europe more than here, of course. One of the steps we've been focused on and been taking is engaging with partners who may have excess LNG supply, like countries in Europe, Japan, for example, where we're planning to give them some, and now they're going to divert it to Europe. So we've been working to help mitigate any impact of a further invasion and a shortage in Europe. Go ahead.
Some of the activity that we've seen today in Ukraine, some of the clashes have been in and around Chernobyl. Does the United States have an assessment of the risk of a radioactive release?
So I do have one actual update on that as well. There's also been there was also a report out. So let me speak to this first, just so I don't forget, about hostages around there as well. So let me speak to that first. We are outraged by credible reports that.
I do have to notice that there's only 2,000 views, less than 2,000 views, on a day where, yeah, I mean, a lot of her press briefings get 10 to 40,000. It looks like 10 to 50,000. Oh, 75,000. So some of her past ones are somewhere in that 7, 10, 11, 10, 11, 15. This one only has 1,900, and again, that's because like 9 different networks broadcasted this.
That Russian soldiers are currently holding the staff of the Chernobyl facilities hostage. This unlawful and dangerous hostage taking, which could upend the routine civil service efforts required to maintain and protect the nuclear waste facilities, is obviously incredibly alarming and greatly concerning. We condemn it and we request their release. In terms of a further assessment, I don't have anything more on that from here.
You gave a readout of how the president spent the past 24 hours or so. First, I wanted to ask about his call with President Zelensky. Did he indicate if he was still in Kyiv? Did he identify his location at this point?
We are aware of where he is located, and we are in touch with him. I would say on that call, what they discussed is President Zelensky's request for the president to condemn the actions of President Putin and the Russians and to engage with other global leaders about it, and that's exactly what he's done.
We've seen a number of statements today from former presidents, President Obama, President Bush, and also saw former President Trump on television talking about this. Has the president, you mentioned during the Afghanistan drawdown, he had been in contact with his predecessors. Has he been in touch with any of his predecessors during this?
He has not been today.
And then in terms of another domestic priority that was potentially included in his meetings today, given the situation, his time and focus and attention on the Supreme Court, on Ukraine, will this affect the timing of his Supreme Court announcement?
We are still on track to make an announcement before the end of the month. We have to do a lot of things around here at the same time. Go ahead.
Just to follow up on the cyber attacks and Article 5 question, I know you said that it's up to NATO to decide, but from a U.S. perspective, would any cyber attack against a NATO ally trigger Article 5, or would there be a measure for what counts?
Again, this is a conversation we would have with our NATO allies and partners. I don't have anything in addition to add to it.
Just to follow up on the Supreme Court, I know you said you're on track, but has he made a final decision given there are basically 2 days left for the end of the month?
Not a final. No job offer has been made. Go ahead.
Thanks. Just a couple. Are there any concerns or indications at this point that Russia had prepared for the sanctions that you're putting in place and kind of developed preemptively ways to blunt that impact?
Well, it's an interesting question, and some of it is hard because it's hard to get into the minds of President Putin and the oligarchs around him. One of the steps we tried to take is to, as we were.
Can you get into the minds of the oligarchs around you? Can you do that for us? Because since we are an oligarchy ourselves, maybe.
We're contemplating the individuals we were going to sanction. We sanctioned family members as well, because what we've seen the tactics they've used in the past is they've moved money around and resources around to family members, and we tried to address that on the front end. In terms of the banking and the financial sector, I mean, it accounts for such a large percentage of how they do business that it would be a difficult thing for them to plan and plot against. And if you look to just even the anticipation of the potential sanctions, as the Leap was mentioning, the ruble is the worst performing currency in the world right now. Their inflation has skyrocketed. So we're even seeing in their markets the anticipated impact even before today, and that's even before the actual squeeze on the financial sector in the country. So it feels to me it would be a little hard to plan around and plot around given the significance of what was done today and the fact that when we sanctioning 10 of Russia's financial institutions and these export control measures, which essentially cuts President Putin off from semiconductors and access to a range of technology he wants for the future. Those are difficult things to plan ahead for.
I guess secondly, does the administration have any assessment for how China is reacting to this at this point? Whether they are willing to provide support to Russia, how much, and has there been any kind of contact there to kind of attempt to move them off of any support?
Well, in terms of what impact they can have, I mean, China only accounts for about 15% of China and Russia. I'm not sure. You can double check me on this. About 15% of the global economy. If you look at G7 partners in the U.S. and Europe, it's about 50%, right? So they cannot cover what the impact of the sanctions that have been announced in coordination with Europe, how they would impact Russia. You know, I think from our perspective as it relates to China, well, I can't get into the heads of what their thinking is. You know, this is a moment for China, for any country, to think about what side of history they want to stand on here. And, you know, that is certainly the case that we would make publicly and privately. I think you saw that Secretary Blinken spoke with his counterpart just a couple of days ago. You know, the president's certainly open to speaking with his counterpart, but I don't have any prediction of that at this point in time or timeline. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. Over the past couple of weeks, as you've been sounding the alarm on this, you've put the sanctions package together, conducted diplomacy with the Russians and the rest of the world. How did the Ukraine...
Let's move on.
Sorry to keep you waiting. Good afternoon.
Oh, please
the
tell me I
Russian
got him
military
on
has
speed.
begun a brutal assault on the people of Ukraine. Without provocation, without justification, without necessity, this is a premeditated attack.
Yeah, it
Vladimir
is.
Putin has been planning this for months, as we've been saying all along. He moved more than 175,000 troops, military equipment and positions along the Ukrainian border. He moved blood supplies into position and built a field hospital, which tells you all you need to know about his intentions all along. He rejected every good faith effort the United States and our allies and partners made to address our mutual security concerns through dialogue to avoid needless conflict and avert human suffering. For weeks, we have been warning that this would happen. And now, it's unfolding largely as we predicted. In the past week, we've seen shelling increase in the Donbass, a region in eastern Ukraine controlled by Russian-backed separatists. The Russian government...
There's been shelling in that region for 8 years straight. We just learned that, right? We just learned that in the beginning of the show. 8 years straight it's been going on.
...has perpetrated cyber attacks against Ukraine. We saw a staged political theater in Moscow, outlandish and baseless claims that Ukraine was about to invade and launch a war against Russia, that Ukraine was prepared to use chemical weapons, that Ukraine committed a genocide. Without any evidence, we saw a flagrant violation of international law in attempting to unilaterally create 2 new so-called republics on sovereign Ukrainian territory. And at the very moment that the United Nations Security Council was meeting to stand up for Ukraine's sovereignty, to stave off invasion, Putin declared his war. Within moments, missile strikes began to fall on historic cities across Ukraine. Then came the air raids, followed by tank evidence about Russia's plans and cyber attacks and false pretexts so that there could be no confusion or cover-up about what Putin was doing.
No cover-up. Not for Putin. Putin ain't gonna cover nothing up. Oh boy. He is entertaining, isn't he? I'm sorry. I seem to be getting jacked here a little bit. We don't need to see him close up. Those wrinkles are intense close up. He's a little better far away. A little better farther away.
Is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences. Today, I'm authorizing additional strong sanctions and new limitations on what can be exported to Russia. This is going to impose severe costs on the Russian economy, both immediately and over time. We have purposefully designed these sanctions to maximize the long-term impact on Russia and to minimize the impact on the United States and our allies. I want to be clear.
Are we going to make sure it just affects Putin and the oligarchs, or are we going to just fuck everybody? Because that's what sanctions usually do. Sanctions are usually war on the common man. You dick.
Clear. The United States is not doing this alone. For months, we've been building a coalition of partners representing well more than half the global economy. 27 members of the European Union, including France, Germany, Italy, as well as the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and many others, to amplify the joint impact of our response. I just spoke with the G7 leaders this morning, and we're in full and total agreement. We will limit Russia's ability to do business in dollars, euros, pounds, and yen to be part of the global economy. We'll limit their ability to do that. We're going to stunt the ability to finance and grow the Russian military. We're going to impose and we're going to impair their ability to compete in high-tech 21st century economy. We've already seen the impact of our actions on Russia's currency and the ruble, which early today hit its weakest level ever in history. The Russia stock
Ever in history, ever in the whole wide history. Aw, God, he's really good at taking Adderall and reading cue cards. Like just again, he's just a figurehead. He doesn't actually do any policy. These are all being made by high-level Democratic consultants. But he's very good at taking Adderall and reading cue cards. You got to give him props, right?
plunged today. The Russian government borrowing rate spiked by over 15%. In today's actions, we've now sanctioned Russian banks that together hold around $1 trillion in assets. We've cut off Russia's largest bank, a bank that holds more than 1/3 of Russia's banking assets by itself, cut it off from the U.S. financial system. And today, we're also blocking 4 more major banks. That means every asset they have in America will be frozen. This includes VTB, the second largest bank in Russia, which has $250 billion in assets. As promised, we're also adding the names to the list of Russian elites and their family members that we're sanctioning as well. As I said on Tuesday, these are people who personally gain from the Kremlin's policies, and they should share in the pain. We will keep up this drumbeat of those designations against corrupt billionaires in the days ahead. On Tuesday, we stopped the Russian government from raising money from U.S. or European investors. Now we're going to apply the same restrictions to Russia's largest state-owned enterprises.
I'm sure there's just, with the Russian propaganda the last 5 years, I'm sure there's just tons of people that have been throwing their money into Russia the last couple of weeks. Like, hey. So they cut that off? Like, come on, man. That doesn't fucking mean anything. If somebody wants to put money into Russia right now, they're still doing it if they're that rich.
Companies with assets that exceed $1.4 trillion. Some of the most powerful impacts of our actions will come over time as we squeeze Russia's access to finances and technology for strategic sectors of its economy and degrade its industrial capacity for years to come. Between our actions and those of our allies and partners, we estimate that we'll cut off more than half of Russia's high-tech imports. It'll strike a blow to their ability to continue to modernize their military. It'll degrade their aerospace industry, including their space program. It'll hurt their ability to build ships, reducing their ability to compete economically. And it will be a major hit to Putin's long-term strategic ambitions. And we're preparing to do more. In addition to the economic penalties we're imposing, we're also taking steps to defend our NATO allies, particularly in the East. Tomorrow, NATO will convene a summit. We'll be there to bring together the leaders of 30 allied nations and close partners to affirm our solidarity and to map out the next steps we will take to further strengthen all aspects of our NATO alliance. Although we provided over $650 million in defensive assistance to Ukraine just this last year, let me say it again. Our forces are not and will not be engaged in the conflict with Russia in Ukraine. Our forces are not going to Europe to fight in Ukraine, but to defend our NATO allies and reassure those allies in the East. As I made crystal clear, the United States will defend every...
He doesn't make anything crystal clear. He's so wishy-washy and mumbly, and this is at 1 1/4. That's why it sounds so like nice and real.
Every inch of NATO territory with the full force of American power. And the good news is, NATO is more united and more determined than ever. There is no doubt that the United States and every NATO ally will meet our Article 5 commitments, which says an attack on one is an attack on all. Over the past few weeks, I ordered thousands of additional forces to Germany and Poland as part of our commitment to NATO. On Tuesday, in response to Russia's aggressive action, including its troop presence in Belarus and the Black Sea, I've authorized the deployment of ground and air forces already stationed in Europe to NATO's eastern flank allies, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania. Our allies have also been stepping up, adding the other allies, the rest of NATO, adding their own forces and capabilities to ensure collective defense. And today, within hours of Russia's unleashing its assault, NATO came together and authorized and activated an activation of response plans. This will enable NATO's high readiness forces to deploy and when and where they are needed to protect our NATO allies on the eastern boundaries of Europe. And now I'm authorizing additional U.S. force capabilities to deploy to Germany as part of NATO's response, including some of the U.S.-based forces that the Department of Defense placed on standby weeks ago. I've also spoken with Defense Secretary Austin and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, about preparations for additional moves should they become necessary to protect our NATO allies and support the greatest military alliance in the history of the world, NATO. As we respond, my administration is using the tools, every tool at its disposal to protect American families and businesses from rising prices at the gas pump. You know, we're taking active steps to bring down the cost, and American oil and gas companies should not exploit this moment to hike their prices to raise profits. You know, in our sanctions package, we specifically designed to allow energy payments to continue. We are closely monitoring energy supplies for any disruption. We've been coordinating with major oil producing and consuming countries toward our common interest to secure global energy supplies. We are actively working with countries around the world to elevate collective release from the strategic petroleum reserves of major energy consuming countries. And the United States will release additional barrels of oil as conditions warrant. I know this is hard and that Americans are already hurting. I will do everything in my power to limit the pain the American people are feeling at the gas pump. This is critical to me. But this aggression cannot go unanswered. If it did, the consequences for America would be much worse. America stands up to bullies. We stand up for freedom. This is who we are.
We stand up to anybody that stands up to us. That's who we are. We will kick your ass if you think the other way. That's who we are.
Let me also repeat the warning I made last week. If Russia pursues cyber attacks against our companies, our critical infrastructure, we are prepared to respond. For months, we've been working closely with the private sector to harden their cyber defenses, sharpen our ability to respond to Russian cyber attacks as well. I spoke last night to President Zelensky of Ukraine, and I assured him that the United States, together with our allies and partners in Europe, will support the Ukrainian people as they defend their country. We'll provide humanitarian relief to ease their suffering. And in the early days of this conflict, Russia propaganda outlets will keep trying to hide the truth and claim success for its military operation against a made-up threat. But history has shown, time and again, how swift gains in territory eventually give way to grinding occupations, acts of mass civil disobedience, and strategic dead ends. The next few weeks and months will be hard on the people of Ukraine. Putin has unleashed a great pain on them. But the Ukrainian people have known 30 years of independence, and they've repeatedly shown that they will not tolerate anyone who tries to take their country backwards. This is a dangerous moment for all of Europe, for the freedom around the world. Putin has committed an assault on the very principles that uphold the global peace. But now, the entire world sees clearly what Putin and his Kremlin allies are really all about. This was never about genuine security concerns on their part. It was always about naked aggression, about Putin's desire for empire by any means necessary, by bullying Russia's neighbors through coercion and corruption, by changing borders by force, and ultimately by choosing a war without a cause. Putin's actions betray his sinister vision for the future of our world, one where nations take what they want by force. But it is a vision that the United States and freedom-loving nations everywhere will oppose with every tool of our considerable power. The United States and our allies and partners will emerge from this stronger, more united, more determined, and more purposeful. And Putin's aggression against Ukraine will end up costing Russia dearly, economically and strategically. We will make sure of that. Putin will be a pariah on the international stage. Any nation that countenances Russia's naked aggression against Ukraine will be stained by association.
Oh my God, he's even boringer. I can't do him for much longer. All right, this is from a while ago, and this is just to remind us the kind of people that we're dealing with. My classic, it's not really a classic clip of the day. This is just
Perry of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. We certainly appreciate your indulgence. We know it's been a long time. In the context of these statements is how I'd like to ask my questions. From 1994, so not too long ago, right? We're talking about 15-year context of this deal for the most strict portions of it. So from 1994, the entire world will be safer as we slow the spread of nuclear weapons is one statement, and also the United States and international inspectors will carefully monitor North Korea to make sure it keeps its commitments. And we all know that's, of course, quotes from President Clinton that none of that happened.
Yes, John Kerry, ex-Secretary of State, he has slipped up on many occasions and just admitted that we're war hawks. So yes,
I mean, North Korea is what it is, and we are where we are. In that context, Secretary Kerry, reading your quote recently with a reporter from Al Arabiya, I don't know how to interpret at this point in time, except to take it at face value, in relation to chance of death to America, death to Israel. We're going to continue our policy. And then it's very troubling, it's very disturbing, it's very troubling, and we'll have to wait and see. What will we have to wait and see, Secretary Kerry? And before you answer, 1979, 52 U.S. hostages, 444 days. 1983, the U.S. Marine Barracks, 241 Americans killed. 1992, the Israeli embassy in Argentina bombed. 2011, the attempted assassination of the Saudi ambassador in D.C. The killings and maimings of hundreds in Iraq and Afghanistan, not to mention support of the Assad, Hezbollah, Hamas, and activities in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. What will we have to wait and see? What was your...
We have to see the implementation of the plan, Congressman. No, look, you and I can have a speech off if you want.
I don't want to have a speech off. I want to understand your comments.
We could have we could have a competition for who is angrier about some of the things Iran has done historically. We understand they've killed Americans. We understand what they did in Khobar Terrace. We understand all of this. But they were marching towards a nuclear weapon.
Mr. Secretary, you must understand, I appreciate this is my time. You must understand the American people see Iran as like a crocodile or a shark that does what it does. And we're saying, well, we're going to give the crocodile or the shark a few more teeth, and let's see if it does something different.
That's just not accurate. That's not accurate.
But that's what we see.
We have left in
Let me say this, too. You have said that we don't have a better option. You keep on saying, well, you haven't provided a better option.
Congressman,
First of all, Mr. Secretary, with all due respect, it is not Congress's job. This is the administration. And if you would use the treaty process as provided by the Constitution, maybe we wouldn't be in this situation. Furthermore, you say, well, this is the only deal we can get, that there's no better deal. Congress has a long history of instituting better deals. Example are 200 treaties, including 80 multilateral accords modified by Congress, including the Arms Control Agreement, SALT II, and the Threshold Test Ban Treaty that failed to reach a vote and were modified. So there is a history for that, of getting a better deal. And if the Ayatollah doesn't like it and doesn't want to negotiate it, oh, boo-hoo. We're here for America. We stand for America. You represent America. With that having been said, it's in another interview, if you don't get a majority in Congress to support this deal, doesn't that undermine the deal? And your statement, it's abbreviated, they don't care over there. And I'm assuming you mean Iraq, as long as the deal is implemented. And that's what we care about, that this deal being implemented.
I just love the war talk, guys. That was the point of that. I do love the war talk. We're so pro-war. It's fantastic. I wanted to end on a different note. So one last clip for the night. I'm calling it good.
Can you stop sugar cravings?
We're going to do that. So we wanted to do a more old school clip, and this is one I had saved for a while. So it seems it is still Black History Month. It is still time to do this type of good old school clip. This is Tom Hartman from the old RT program, and this is him confronting the Grand Wizard of the KKK. Ah, shit.
Obama is an illegal president. At least that's what a Maryland KKK group thinks, and they're trying to do something about it. The Confederate White Knights of Maryland are meeting tomorrow in a government building in Cecil County, Maryland, to discuss plans to impeach President Obama. Imperial Wizard Richard Preston, leader of the group, told a local paper that Barack Hussein Obama is an illegal president. He needs to be removed from office. We also want Obamacare shut down. It's against citizens' rights. The FBI has already notified Maryland State Police about the meeting and what to expect at it. Joining me now to talk more about tomorrow's meeting and the motivation for it is Richard Preston, Imperial Wizard of the Confederate White Knights of Maryland.
How are you doing today?
Mr. Preston, good to see you.
That was not the voice I was expecting.
I guess. I don't. Here's, first of all, why impeach Obama?
Well, for one thing, President Barack Hussein Obama has never shown his citizenship papers, no matter who is asked, who is offered, or anything else. Glenn Beck's website, The Blaze, now has information on it showing that he was an Indonesian citizen from before grade school clean up through college.
Uh, the Blaze has evidence. I love this. Is oh, whew. I needed that. I needed
Dual
that.
citizenship is not supposed to be allowed for a president, for one.
Would you be in favor of Ted Cruz as president?
I could care less if Ben Carson was president, as long as whoever's president is.
Ted Cruz was born in Canada and his dad was Cuban.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I would have a problem with that.
You'd be opposed to that.
The whole thing is, an American president should be an American. For a president to be from any other country or raised in another country, you don't know where his allegiance lies to his country.
That's what the Constitution says. So you just
right.
Okay. So why the KKK? I don't get this. Back 100 years ago, or 150 years ago, you had slavery, and the KKK was principally a police force. I mean, it was an instrument of maintaining racial separation and maintaining people who were slaves. I mean, there's no other way to say it. But
Actually,
nowadays, it seems like it's more of a clown show.
Well, the biggest thing is, when the Klan first started, it really had nothing to do with maintaining the slavery. It actually was founded to stop the Reconstruction of the South because of what was going on with Southern
when it was reformulated after Birth of a Nation came out. Because that was when the Klan
and that was like in
1903.
Yeah, it was actually 1915 when Joseph Simmons redid it up on Stone Mountain. When the Klan came back out at that given point, it was actually more so about the immigration that was coming into the country and that the government wasn't trying to regulate anything.
But we had legal racial segregation at that point.
Yes, we did.
We don't anymore.
No, we don't have any legal segregation, but look at some of what's taking place in our country at this given time. The Klan is no longer, every aspect of the Klan has been born. It has had a goal or a meaning for what it was to do.
Right.
In the beginning, it was about trying to stop the Reconstruction of the South. During Joseph Simmons' period, when he came back out, it was to make the government do something that it was not doing. In the 1960s, the Klan got a very bad name. Now, if you go past the 60s, back into the 1920s,
it got a very bad name. Oh my goodness, this guy's a whew. Yeah, and propaganda works, and you can get people to believe shit if they're angry and uneducated. Any education will seem like any amount of information will seem like, wow, that must be right then. Like they don't ever uneducated people. I'm not trying to be a dick and say he's uneducated, but this just sounds stupid as shit. Like he sounds like he's very familiar with the information that he's been given, but he's never looked outside of that information. He's like, he just represent,
there were over 4 million Americans back then that were actually Klan members. There was doctors, lawyers,
it was a big deal particularly across the South.
We even had one United States president in our Klan book states that was knighted in the White House.
Right.
The big thing is, it was not a bad organization.
Well, why today?
The Klan's never died. It's always been behind the scenes.
No, I get that, but it's like, we sort of tongue-in-cheek. I mean, we had this thing about, why are guys obsessed with guns? Long things that shoot things. And maybe some guys with small penises are obsessed with guns because, hey, it's compensation. But I don't get what the I'm white thing and everybody else has to be, kept down or pushed away.
No, that's just it. It's not about keeping anybody down, okay? It is about white pride, though. The Klan itself.
But you can't have white pride without saying, other people are less than.
But that's just it. We're not saying that other people are less than us. What people said during the 1960s is stuck in everybody's head. Things that happened in the 1960s is stuck in everybody's head.
So you're not a white supremacist.
No, we're white separatists. We do believe that we have the right as white people to stay white people. If you really read the Holy Bible, which the Klan is a very Christian organization.
Yeah, you have the. What the fuck does that even mean? You have the remain. That's so. That's ridiculous, right? Like, we're white people who want to remain white. So fucking remain white, dude. Nobody's like injecting you with freaking minority. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? You want your areas to remain uncultured. You want your areas to remain you want other people to hide their freaking culture around you? Like, what are you talking about?
The Holy Bible actually separates the races.
The Holy Bible does a whole lot of stuff.
Right, and
I don't
that's
think
the
you'd
whole
be
thing.
in
We are
favor of,
right,
yeah.
and we are a Christian organization. We always have been. I don't mind. Like I said, somebody asked me one day if the reason I was against Barack Obama is because of the color of his skin. And my answer was, I have no problem if America wants a black president. I have no problem if America wants a Hispanic president or an Oriental president. It does not matter to me if he's an American citizen and has the will for the American people in his best behalf.
What kind of fear drives somebody to become a member of the Klan? What are you afraid
Really, it's not fear. It's more so white pride. We have a lot of people that have joined.
You know, white people run this country. White people have the majority of the money in this country. White people have the power in this country. I mean, why do you need to do the chest thumping thing?
It's not so much the chest thumping.
You've already got it all.
I'm not saying it that way, okay?
White privilege is a huge power.
Right now in this country, no American has it all. If you think about the fact that
white people have it a whole lot more than anybody else.
I'm not saying they don't. I mean, white people have a lot. But it's the point that this country right now is being flooded by illegal immigrants that are not coming here to care about becoming an American citizen.
Yeah.
Our ancestors, all of us, most of us in America anyway, are from some kind of a ethnic background of culture. Yeah. It doesn't matter if it's
Richard,
Irish.
No, I got it. We're out of time. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I got it. You're a jackass. Okay. Yeah, I don't think anybody had I would have loved to seen Tom really just rip into that guy. That would have been fun. But, oh well. That was my shorter stream. Usually I take Thursdays off, but since I missed a couple nights in the past week, I wanted to make up. And now we are going to go ahead and say, tomorrow night I'm going to do my first trial at a yoga stream. Making my screen bigger, being a little less, talking more health, having more health-centered videos, and I do have an NPR clip so I can actually put my whole picture up and, do some light working out when I get home from work to stretch the pain out and talk some news and still get Bernie, still get Stoney. You can choose to do the yoga with or without me. I don't care. You can just sit around and get stoned and still listen to some good NPR, get some good news on with me. Your Stoney Progressive. So come bake, come have a beer. Your post Friday night, I'll be here. Cheers, guys. Thanks for joining me, and I'll hope to see you in the next few nights. Some Stoney Progressive around midnight Eastern Standard.